Normandy, June 1944, dawn broke through a pale gray mist over the hedgerows of Normandy. The air was heavy with cordite and dew. The earth churned to a paste of mud and steel. An American M4 Sherman moved cautiously along a narrow farm road, its hull coated in dust and clotted foliage for camouflage. Inside, 5 men breathed as one: driver, gunner, loader, commander, and radio man, hearts pounding to the slow rhythm of the engine. Sanandanon. Then, from 800 meters away, a flash. The crack of a German 75mm Qk-42 cannon shattered the morning calm. The shell streaked across the field, slamming into the Sherman's glacis plate with a thunderous clang. Sparks, smoke, shrapnel, but no fire. The tank lurched, groaned, but did not stop. The crew's voices cut through the chaos. "Still moving! Still moving!" Across the ridge, the Panther gunner froze. He had hit his mark, a perfect shot. Yet the American tank refused to die. That moment of disbelief echoed across the Western Front, and into the legend of the Sherman. By the summer of 1944, Europe had become a continent of steel. After nearly 5 years of brutal war, the fields of France and the ruins of Montjuïc, cities from Kharkov to Cannes, echoed with the grinding tracks of tanks, symbols of both destruction and liberation. When Allied troops stormed ashore on June 6, 1944, the landings of Operation Overlord did not just bring soldiers. They brought machines, thousands of them. Among them, the most ubiquitous silhouette was the M4 Sherman, America's workhorse tank. Compact, reliable, and easily shipped across oceans, the Sherman represented not only American industry, but also a philosophy of war built on speed, numbers, and adaptability. In contrast, waiting behind, the bocage of Normandy were the armored pride of Hitler's Wehrmacht. The Panther and Tiger tanks, sleek, menacing, and engineered to lethal perfection. They were designed to dominate in tank-to-tank combat. The Panther, in particular, had been introduced after the shock of the Soviet T-34 in 1941, with ED-Tigers, its sloped frontal armor and powerful Kak-42 L-70 gun, It could destroy a Sherman at over a kilometer's distance. On paper, it was untouchable. For the Germans, the Panther embodied the culmination of engineering mastery. Armor, that could deflect most Allied shells, and firepower that could pierce any Allied tank in return. Its design was intricate, almost surgical. Every bolt, every weld crafted for performance. But that precision came at a cost: weight, mechanical fragility, and the inability to produce them in the numbers the war now demanded. The Sherman, by contrast, was born of American pragmatism. When U.S. engineers designed it in 1941, their goal wasn't to build the strongest tank, it was to build one that could reach the battlefield, fight, and keep fighting. Its medium-weight 75mm gun, its Continental radial engine, and its versatile chassis made it easier to repair and modify. The Allies could deploy thousands, while Germany struggled to field hundreds. By the time the Allies landed in France, that philosophy had already proven itself. For every Panther that rolled out of a German factory, nearly 10 Shermans emerged from American assembly lines. What the Sherman lacked in armor thickness or gun power, it made up in sheer presence. It was everywhere. Still, reputation mattered. To the soldiers inside those Shermans, the whispers were hard to ignore. Ronson, they called it. After the cigarette lighter that lights up the first time, every time. The British troops had their own grim nickname. Tommy Cooker. Stories of Shermans bursting into flames after a single hit spread through tank. Battalions like smoke through a hull breach. Yet behind the grim nicknames, a quieter truth was emerging. One the Germans would soon face firsthand. American crews were learning. They began using terrain, coordination, and mobility as their armor. They learned that the Sherman's high reliability meant it was rarely abandoned. Its powered turret traverse, far faster than the Panther's manual crank, allowed it to react quickly. Sometimes seconds meant survival. German commanders began reporting strange encounters. After hitting Shermans, they saw them continue to move, sometimes even firing back. Not all hits penetrated cleanly. The Panther's shells often glanced off the Sherman's angled front, played or struck at oblique angles due to the hilly Norman terrain. And when they did penetrate, the Sherman's crews often survived, thanks to wet ammunition stowage, a design introduced in late 1943 that surrounded shell racks with protective fluid to prevent the deadly brew-up, fires that had haunted earlier models. Still, to the men fighting, each battle was a test of nerve and faith. For every Sherman that burned, others kept rolling forward, carrying not invincibility, but a stubborn kind of endurance, the will to outlast an enemy who, for all his technological edge, was being buried under a tide of men and machines. By July 1944, the tank war in Normandy had become a brutal chess match fought in hedgerows, Panthers lying in ambush, Shermans advancing under artillery smoke and air cover. It was in these chaotic duels that German crews first saw their shots fail to end the fight, and where the legend of the indestructible Sherman began to take shape. And as the Allies broke out of Normandy, the contrast between the two, philosophies, precision, and pragmatism, would soon decide the fate of armored warfare in Europe. By late July 1944, the war in Normandy had become an unforgiving contest of adaptation. The hedgerows, thick, centuries-old walls of earth and vegetation, turned every field into a fortress. Visibility was measured in meters, and ambushes lurked at every turn. For both sides, it was a test of nerves as much as machines. German Panther battalions, though powerful, were few. Their tanks often waited in ambush positions, engines off, barrels fixed toward the narrow lanes that Allied armor was forced to take. The moment a Sherman appeared, the first shot was decisive. But it was also risky. Once they fired, the flash and noise gave away their position, and American artillery and fighter bombers were swift to answer. The U.S. Army understood this battlefield calculus. Its armored doctrine wasn't built around dueling enemy tanks. It was about combined arms. Infantry, artillery, and air power were the real killing tools. Tanks were part of a larger machine. The Sherman's job was to move with speed, support infantry, and exploit breakthroughs, not to go one-on-one with Panthers. But in the chaos of war, those duels happened all the same. That's where the true strength of the Sherman began to emerge. Not in its armor or gun, but in what surrounded it. A single Panther was deadly, but the Sherman rarely fought alone. American armored companies moved in groups, overlapping fields of fire, radio-linked and coordinated with infantry. When one Sherman was hit, another could immediately respond, calling in artillery or maneuvering to flank the German position. The Panther, by contrast, was often isolated. Its superior gun demanded range, a luxury Normandy's terrain did not always allow. Its long barrel, ideal for open country engagements, became a liability in tight hedgerows. Its complex suspension and heavy armor made recovery difficult when damaged. Worse still, its gearbox and final drive were fragile. Mechanical failures were common even before battle began. To the German tankers, the Sherman was crude, but it was always there, always running. The Americans' ability to repair, replace, and return tanks to battle within days baffled many Wehrmacht commanders. Damaged Shermans were pulled off the line, repaired in field depots using interchangeable parts, and sent back almost immediately. German tanks, in contrast, could take weeks to fix, if parts existed at all. Then came the Firefly, a British adaptation of the Sherman mounting the powerful 17-pounder gun, capable of piercing a Panther's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. To German crews, these looked like ordinary Shermans until they fired. The first reports of Panthers being destroyed, head-on by what appeared to be standard American tanks, added to the growing confusion. American crews also began improvising. They added sandbags, spare track links, and welded armor plates to their hulls. Engineers modified the tanks to cut through hedgerows, the famous Rhino, Shermans with welded steel prongs that could breach obstacles and surprise entrenched defenders. This constant adaptation reflected the American approach to warfare. Flexible, responsive, and built on scale. The Sherman could be modified into recovery vehicles, flamethrowers, tank destroyers, and even amphibious DD models that swam ashore on D-Day. It wasn't a perfect tank, but it was a perfect tool for an army that valued movement and initiative over perfection. And that difference was psychological as much as mechanical. For German crews, every loss was irreplaceable. For American crews, losses were expected, but temporary. New tanks, new men, and endless supplies arrived daily through the beaches and ports of Normandy. It was an industrial rhythm that no German design genius could stop. By August 1944, as Allied forces closed the Falaise pocket, the Wehrmacht's armored core was collapsing. Panthers and Tigers were left abandoned, out of fuel, out of parts, or destroyed by artillery and air attack. Meanwhile, Shermans kept advancing, not because they were invulnerable, but because they were sustainable. To the Germans who witnessed their shells bounce off Shermans, 108 ton Artillerie-Centrans, angled hulls or saw-burning tanks replaced almost instantly by fresh ones. The message was clear. They were fighting not just a tank, but an idea built on endurance. That idea would follow them across France, into Belgium, and eventually to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where the myth of German invincibility would face its final test. Inside a Sherman, war was intimate. The cramped steel walls pressed against every movement. The smell of oil, sweat, and burnt cordite clung to the air. The men who fought inside called it a mobile coffin. But it was also their home, their shield, and their only chance of survival. The typical American tank crew was young, often no older than 22. They came from farms, factories, and city blocks across the United States. Their training was brief but focused. Teamwork, gunnery, and keeping the tank alive. Each man knew his role by instinct. The gunner's hand hovered near the elevation wheel. The loader's muscles remembered every motion, and the commander's eyes scanned the horizon through narrow periscopes. When German shells struck, seconds determined who lived. A penetrating hit could set off ammunition or ignite fuel, but many crews survived thanks to the Sherman's evolving safety features. The wet stowage system, introduced in late 1943, reduced catastrophic fires by over 75%. It meant the difference between dying in flame and scrambling out alive. Those who escaped their burning tanks often climbed into another within hours. There was no time to mourn, only to keep moving. The stories spread. Shermans taking multiple hits and still advancing. Crews swapping tanks like rifles. To the men, it was less about heroism and more about duty, staying alive long enough to finish the job. The Germans who faced them began to sense this resilience. They called the Americans steady, not reckless, soldiers who fought with patience and persistence. In the bocage, where every field became a trap, that endurance mattered more than armor thickness. The Sherman's design reflected America's wartime philosophy, function before perfection. Engineers in Detroit, Lima, and Chicago built a tank that was not the strongest or heaviest, but the most adaptable. Its 47-degree sloped front armor gave it an effective resistance greater than its nominal thickness suggested. Though the Panther's 75mm high-velocity shells could penetrate it at long range, many impacts glanced away when the Sherman was angled or moving. Field studies in Normandy later revealed that nearly 1 in 4 direct hits failed to destroy the tank outright. An unexpected survival rate that baffled German gunners. The Sherman's powered turret traverse, an electric motor operated by a foot pedal, gave it a decisive edge in close combat. A Sherman could rotate its gun toward a target in seconds. The Panther, using a hand crank, took longer, especially at low engine speeds. In tight terrain, that difference often meant first shot, and first shot usually meant survival. By 1944, new variants appeared. The M4A3E8 Easy 8, succeeded in 2020 with wider tracks and improved suspension, handled rough ground and recoil better. The 76-meter high-velocity gun, introduced mid-1944, allowed Shermans to punch through the side armor of Panthers at standard engagement ranges. The Firefly, with its long 17-pounder, could destroy even a tiger from a distance. But not all improvements were visible. The Sherman's genius was in logistics. Interchangeable parts meant any engine, track, or gun could be replaced quickly. Tank recovery teams, the wrecker crews, Sekshu, risked their lives towing damaged vehicles back under fire. Within hours, a tank hit in the morning could be repaired and back in line by nightfall. German armor, meanwhile, was technically magnificent but logistically fragile. The Panther's transmission often failed after 500 kilometers. Spare parts were scarce, fuel scarcer still. Many Panthers were abandoned intact simply because they could not be moved. In the language of war, the Sherman wasn't a super tank. It was a system, one that fused industrial might, repair infrastructure, and human adaptability. It was the embodiment of total war, a machine that could fight endlessly because it was never truly alone. From the German side, the first encounters with the Sherman in Normandy were routine, until they weren't. Reports from the Panzerlehrdivision and the 12th SS, Hitlerjugenddivision in July 1944, note incidents where multiple shells struck Allied tanks without visible effect. To German gunners, trained to trust the precision of their optics and the power of their cannons, this was unsettling. Mehrere Treffer, keine Explosion, multiple hits, no explosion, appeared repeatedly in after-action notes. Some attributed it to poor ammunition, others to luck. But as the weeks passed, the pattern persisted. Sometimes it was physics. At oblique angles, even a Panther's high-velocity shell could ricochet. Sometimes it was range. At over 1,000 meters, kinetic energy dropped sharply. And sometimes it was simply the Sherman's crew training, their habit of keeping the hull angled, presenting no flat surface to the enemy. But to many Germans, it felt as though the enemy's tanks were protected by something else, a relentless will to fight. Even when a Sherman was hit and immobilized, its gun might still fire. Even when burning, another would appear behind it. Panther crews began to feel the weight of attrition, the realization that they could win battles, but not the war of endurance. For them, the Sherman came to symbolize the overwhelming machine of Allied production. Its persistence under fire wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Each hit that failed to kill reminded German tankers that they were outnumbered, outsupplied, and slowly being surrounded. The myth of German superiority in armor began to erode not in the factories, but in the fields, one ricochet, one surviving Sherman at a time. And as the Allies pushed eastward through France, the pattern deepened, a test of minds, machines, and morale. The Sherman's strength was never its armor alone. It was the way it was used. American doctrine emphasized teamwork over individual tank duels, and in Normandy's labyrinth of hedgerows, that philosophy found its proof. While German Panthers sought advantage through ambush and first-shot lethality, Sherman crews relied on coordination. Infantry scouts moved ahead, engineers cleared paths, and artillery was always within reach. When a Panther was spotted, Shermans worked together like a pack. One drew fire while others maneuvered to flank. The tank's fast turret rotation and high mobility allowed quick response to fleeting targets. This cooperation extended across branches. Allied fighter bombers, armed with rockets and bombs, became extensions of the armored spearhead. Whenever German tanks opened fire, they risked exposing their positions to air attack. American crews learned to bait those shots. calling in P-47 to thunderbolts or typhoon strikes within minutes. On the ground, tactics evolved daily. The hunter-killer pair, a Sherman leading, another covering from concealment, became common. Commanders like General Omar Bradley insisted that flexibility and communication mattered more than any armor thickness. The result was not glamorous, but effective, a moving front that could absorb losses and keep advancing. The Germans, trained in precision engagements and command rigidity, struggled to adapt. Their tank aces, like Michael Wittmann, could annihilate columns in minutes. But when they fell, there were few replacements. American success didn't come from any single tank, but from how the entire system fought as one. Behind every Sherman on the battlefield was a world of factories, convoys, and logistics unseen by most soldiers. America's industrial network was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Between 1942 and 1945, over 49,000 Shermans rolled off assembly lines in Detroit, Cleveland, and California, each one born of the same interchangeable design. This was the United States' true weapon, standardization. Engines from Ford could fit in hulls built by Chrysler. Tracks from one plant could be mounted on tanks from another. The system was so unified that a single supply train, arriving at Cherbourg, could service dozens of tank divisions. When a Sherman was damaged, mechanics in field depots worked like surgeons. They had pre-packed parts, kits, manuals, and cranes built specifically for rapid turnaround. German Panther units, meanwhile, waited weeks for a new gearbox or final drive, if one ever came. Fuel told the same story. The Sherman's gasoline engines were inefficient, but gasoline itself was plentiful. The Germans' high-performance Maybach engines ran on premium fuel that Germany no longer had. As the Reich's supply lines collapsed, even undamaged Panthers were abandoned. Out of fuel, not courage. The Sherman's production philosophy extended to variants, from flamethrower tanks in the Pacific to amphibious DD models for D-Day. The chassis became a universal platform. The same factories built self-propelled guns, recovery vehicles, and tank destroyers. Every design shared common parts and training manuals, a logistical miracle that no other army could match. To the Germans who faced this tide, the realization was devastating. Every Panther lost was irreplaceable. Every Sherman lost was a delay, not a defeat. It was this industrial resilience that allowed American armor to recover faster, move farther, and sustain pressure long after German production ground to a halt. The battlefield victories that stunned German crews were, in truth, victories born on the factory floor. War is not only a contest of weapons, it is a test of endurance and belief. For the men inside the Sherman, each battle demanded a balance between fear and resolve. They knew the Panther's gun could kill them with a single shot. They saw burning tanks beside them, the black smoke curling into the sky like warnings from the earth itself. And yet they climbed back in, again and again. Survivors often spoke not of hatred or revenge, but of duty, the quiet understanding that their courage sustained the men beside them. Crews developed deep bonds. 5 men became a single heartbeat. If one tank was destroyed, others avenged it. In the long months of fighting across France, Belgium, and into Germany, this sense of shared endurance became the true armor of the Allied tank force. German soldiers, too, felt the psychological weight shift. They began to realize that while their machines might dominate in duels, they were losing the larger war of exhaustion. They could not match the Americans' ability to recover, replace, and fight again. The sight of Shermans advancing after direct hits, repaired or replaced almost instantly, broke morale as surely as any bombardment. By the autumn of 1944, captured German reports revealed growing frustration. The Americans do not stop, even when we destroy 10, 20 come the next day. This was not exaggeration. It was a cry of recognition that the war's center of gravity had changed. The Panther was a masterpiece. The Sherman was a movement. One embodied brilliance, the other relentlessness. And as winter approached, this clash of philosophies, precision versus persistence, would converge again in the frozen forests of Belgium. There, amid snow and silence, the Panther's power would meet the Sherman's resilience in a final, defining trial. Normandy to Falaise, summer 1944. The roads of Normandy ran red with dust and diesel smoke by mid-July. The Allies were pushing inland, field by field, through a landscape shredded by artillery and aircraft. The German panzer divisions were fighting for time, trying to slow the inevitable breakout toward the Seine. It was here, in the tangled countryside between Saint-Lô and Falaise, that the Sherman and the Panther met in their most defining duels. A Sherman column of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division crept through a narrow farm road near Percy. Reconnaissance had warned of enemy armor ahead, but the bocage left no clear lines of sight. The crews advanced at 10 miles per hour. Guns traversed slightly left and right, waiting for the first flash. Then it came, a Panther, hidden behind an orchard wall, fired at point-blank range. The shell struck the lead Sherman squarely on the glacis plate. A roar, a flash, and disbelief. The tank stopped, its paint scorched, but its armor held. Before the Panther could reload, two Shermans flanked through the hedgerow, their 75mm guns spitting fire. One round struck the Panther's lower hull. The second pierced its side, igniting ammunition. The German crew bailed out into the smoke. Such scenes repeated across Normandy. Not all Shermans survived, far from it, but every instance of endurance began to shift perception. German tankers, once confident in their technical superiority, found themselves outmaneuvered in terrain that favored the flexible. The Panther's long barrel was useless when forced to fight at 50 meters. In Operation Cobra, July 25 to 31, the American breakout from Saint-Lô, Shermans surged through gaps created by carpet bombing. The Panther's range advantage evaporated under the choking dust of low-altitude attack aircraft. German defensive lines, once formidable, began to crumble. Tanks that could once dominate open fields now died by the dozens, caught without fuel or mobility. At the Falaise pocket in August, the German army's last stand in Normandy turned into a slaughter. Panthers and tigers tried to cover the retreat toward the Seine, but they were hunted relentlessly. Air power struck from above, while Sherman units sealed the roads from below. The once mighty panzer divisions were reduced to wrecks smoldering in the ditches. Eyewitnesses recalled the eerie sight. Dozens of Panthers disabled not by penetration, but by mechanical failure or fuel starvation, their crews blowing them up to avoid capture. The Sherman, meanwhile, rolled on. Damaged tanks were recovered, patched, and sent forward again. It was a war of momentum, and momentum belonged to the Allies. The moment of realization. For the German High Command, the reports were sobering. The vaunted Panther, the tank that was supposed to restore armored dominance, was proving vulnerable not only to enemy fire, but to the relentless grind of logistics. In the field, its great gun was unmatched. But what use was a weapon if it could not reach the fight, if it broke down, if it could not be refueled? In contrast, the Sherman's reliability had become legend. Units could march 50 miles in a day, fight, and keep moving. American mechanics worked miracles with wrenches and welding torches, often under shell fire. The frontline soldiers noticed. They no longer saw their tanks as death traps. They saw them as durable, almost faithful companions. At the same time, German crews were forced to confront an unfamiliar emotion: doubt. Many wrote home of frustration, their rounds hitting without effect, their machines failing at crucial moments. Panther gunners, who once bragged of one-shot kills, began to question every encounter. The sight of a Sherman shrugging off a hit, or worse, returning fire, carried a psychological sting far greater than any loss statistic. The Allies captured this shift in morale. Reports circulated among U.S. units of Panther shells bouncing, of Shermans surviving hits. Whether entirely true or not, these stories became powerful motivators. They gave crews confidence, reinforcing the idea that courage and teamwork could offset any disadvantage in hardware. By September 1944, as Allied forces surged toward the German border, one fact had become clear. The Sherman was no longer merely enduring, it was prevailing, not through superiority of design, but through the total integration of production, repair, logistics, and will. The Germans still fought with skill and ferocity. Panthers destroyed hundreds of Shermans in individual clashes. Yet each victory meant less when replacements rolled in overnight. German officers spoke bitterly of endless steel, an enemy that could not be exhausted. As the rains of autumn turned the French countryside into mud, the war of armor evolved from duels to attrition. The Panther's reign as the supreme predator was waning, and deep within German ranks, a quiet fear began to take root. If the enemy's tanks could survive their best shots, what could stop the tide that followed them? That question would be answered in the cold forests of the Ardennes, where, in the last great German offensive of the war, the Panthers would once again face the Shermans. But this time, the outcome would no longer be in doubt. December 16, 1944. The dawn broke pale and frozen over the dense forests of the Ardennes. Snow muffled the thunder of engines. From the mist rose the silhouettes of German armor. Panthers, Tigers, Jagdpanthers, leading Hitler's final offensive in the West. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Their objective was audacious: split the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and shatter the momentum built since Normandy. For a brief moment, German confidence flickered again. Their tanks, hidden in forests, struck without warning. Sherman units, scattered, unprepared, found themselves facing overwhelming firepower in blizzards of snow and smoke. At Lanzerath, St. Vith, and Bastogne, the opening blows were devastating. Panthers destroyed columns of Shermans at long range, their 75mm guns tearing through armor like paper. The winter terrain favored ambush. German optics and gunnery were unmatched. Many American tankers described the first days as chaos. Machines frozen solid, engines slow to start, shells ricocheting off enemy armor. And yet, something was different. The Shermans that survived the first barrage did not retreat. They regrouped. Units quickly reorganized, adapting the same mobile doctrine that had carried them across France. They set up kill zones, coordinated with artillery and infantry, and fought back yard by yard. At Bastogne, encircled and outnumbered, elements of the 10th Armored Division held the town alongside the 101st Airborne. In snow so thick it muted sound, Shermans fought duels at 50 meters. Panther shells slammed into them, tearing off track guards, cracking hulls, but many Shermans stayed alive. Their wet ammo stowage prevented fires. Their radios kept them in contact. Crews shifted position, reloaded, returned fire. In one skirmish near Marvy, a Panther ambushed a Sherman column, destroying 2 instantly. The 3rd Sherman, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, maneuvered through the smoke, closed the distance, and fired into the Panther's flank. The German tank erupted in flame. Boggess's crew, shaken but alive, advanced, unaware they had just taken part in the turning tide of the battle. Fire, ice, and air power. As the offensive stretched on, the Germans' greatest enemy returned: logistics. Snowbound roads, fuel shortages, and Allied airstrikes crippled the offensive. Panthers sat abandoned in the forests, their great engines silent for lack of gasoline. Meanwhile, American repair teams worked through the freezing nights. Field depots at Verdun and Liège became assembly lines, patching damaged Shermans and sending them back to the front within hours. By Christmas Eve, the skies cleared, and with clear skies came the roar of P-47, thunderbolts and typhoons. The Allied air forces, grounded for days by weather, now hunted the German armor relentlessly. Every Panther that fired risked revealing its position. Every column became a target. The Shermans, advancing under air cover, regained momentum. At Celle, a decisive clash unfolded. German Panthers of the 2nd Panzer Division, running dangerously low on fuel, faced Shermans of the 2nd Armored Division. The fight was brutal and close. American gunners, using the new 76mm M1A1 guns, fired armor-piercing rounds from mere hundreds of meters. The battle ended with wrecked tanks on both sides, but the Panthers were gone for good. Not destroyed by superior weapons, but by exhaustion. Across the Ardennes, German officers began reporting the same grim pattern seen in Normandy. Even when they scored perfect hits, Shermans refused to die easily. Many glancing shots deflected off icy armor plates at odd angles. Others struck non-vital sections, and even when tanks burned, replacements arrived faster than anyone could believe. By early January 1945, the German advance had stalled. The bulge in the Allied line flattened under the combined weight of armor, artillery, and air superiority. In retreat, Panther crews abandoned dozens of tanks, not from cowardice, but because their machines simply could not go any farther. American soldiers who passed the frozen hulks were stunned by their size and complexity. They examined the thick armor, the massive guns, and realized how close the fight had been. Yet they also saw something else: rows of Shermans beside them, scarred, patched, and still running. It was here, amid the snow and silence, that the myth finally cracked. German prisoners, questioned after the battle, spoke with a mixture of respect and disbelief. They had watched Shermans take hits they thought impossible to survive. They had seen American armor return the next day after being destroyed the night before. The phrase echoed in reports and diaries. They keep coming. Always more. Always the same tank. This was not a boast of invincibility. It was a testament to endurance. The Sherman had endured not because it was the strongest, but because it was never alone, supported by logistics, teamwork, and the will of its crews. By the time the snows melted, the Panther's glory was gone. The German armored corps, once the terror of Europe, had been bled dry. In its place rolled thousands of Shermans, carrying the war toward the Rhine and the heart of Germany. The tank that was supposed to be obsolete had outlasted the machine built to destroy it. And in that reversal of fate lay the real victory, not of steel, but of spirit. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the wreckage of Europe told its own story. Fields from Normandy to the Rhine were littered with the twisted remains of tanks, German and American alike. Yet amid the ruins, a striking pattern emerged. For every destroyed Sherman, there were several more still running, patched and reused, advancing into Germany even as the Reich collapsed. In the first months after the war, Allied ordnance teams began the meticulous work of collecting data. They studied penetration marks, measured armor impacts, and interviewed tank crews. The findings surprised many. Despite its fearsome reputation, the Panther had not been the unstoppable beast of wartime myth. Its front armor was formidable, but its sides and rear were vulnerable, and its complex mechanics made it prone to failure. The Sherman, on the other hand, had been exactly what its designers intended: a tank that could survive the war, even if it didn't always survive the battle. British Army studies in 1945 found that thanks to the introduction of wet ammunition storage, crew survival rates in late war, Shermans were among the highest of any armored vehicle of the conflict. Penetrations that once caused catastrophic fires now resulted in far fewer fatalities. American crews learned to trust their machines again. Reports from the 3rd and 9th Armies recorded countless cases of tanks taking multiple hits, withdrawing, being repaired, and returning to action within days. The numbers told the larger truth. Germany had produced roughly 6,000 Panthers during the war. The United States had built more than 49,000 Shermans. Even if the Panther could destroy a Sherman 3 times over, it was a mathematical impossibility for Germany to win a prolonged armored campaign. Logistics, not lethality, had decided the outcome. Captured German officers acknowledged as much. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, admitted in post-war interviews that quantity has a quality all its own. He noted that while the Panther and Tiger were technologically superior, they were not the tanks for a long war. Their production required time, skilled labor, and materials Germany no longer possessed. In contrast, the United States had perfected mass production as a weapon. The same assembly lines that produced automobiles now churned out tanks, spare engines, transmissions, and tools in endless supply. Entire armored divisions could be re-equipped within weeks. Every destroyed Sherman was a temporary setback, never a strategic loss. Beyond the statistics, there was a human cost and a human victory. Tens of thousands of tankers had fought and died inside those Shermans, yet their sacrifice achieved something far greater than the machine itself. It proved that flexibility, cooperation, and endurance could overcome even the most advanced enemy weaponry. The myth of German invincibility, forged in 1940's Blitzkrieg, had finally shattered. On the battlefields of the Ardennes, where snow still covered the carcasses of burned-out tanks, the contrast between the two philosophies of war was stark. The Panther, a symbol of precision engineering, lay silent, its fuel tanks dry, its gears frozen in place. The Sherman, lighter, simpler, and less glamorous, remained the face of victory. Post-war assessments by the U.S. Army concluded that the Sherman's effectiveness could not be measured by individual duels. Its true value lay in the system it served, a web of supply, repair, and coordination that allowed it to fight continuously. It was the backbone of an army built for sustained operations, not quick conquests. And while German tank aces like Wittmann and Bachmann entered legend, so too did the nameless Sherman crews who refused to surrender to fear. Men who climbed back into their machines even after seeing what a Panther shell could do. By the end of 1945, thousands of Shermans were still operational, serving in occupation forces across Europe. Many were shipped east to rebuild Allied armies, or south to new conflicts that would define the post-war world. The Panther, though feared, never returned in large numbers. It had been too complex to maintain peace, too fragile for the new industrial order. The tank that Germany had expected to dominate the battlefield had burned out in less than a year. The tank America had built to endure became the blueprint for the modern age. And in that difference, between brilliance and balance, lay the secret to the Sherman's quiet triumph. When the Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Sherman was everywhere, from the deserts of North Africa to the cobblestone villages of Germany itself. By war's end, it had become more than a tank. It was a symbol of an industrial democracy at war, imperfect but relentless. As the smoke of battle cleared, military planners and historians began to debate the legacy of the Sherman. Many soldiers remembered its thin armor and limited gun power. Others remembered how it always started when needed, how it could drive through mud where heavier tanks bogged down, and how they could depend on it to get them home. American engineers studied the wrecks left across Europe, comparing them with captured German and Soviet designs. Their conclusion was subtle yet profound. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war. It was the most effective. It embodied a philosophy that would define post-war warfare: mobility, repairability, and combined arms coordination over sheer firepower. The German Panther, for all its brilliance, had been a creature of extremes, magnificent in concept, disastrous in logistics. Allied intelligence found that as much as half of all Panthers lost in 1944-45 were abandoned, not destroyed. They ran out of fuel, broke down, or became trapped in terrain their engines could not conquer. Meanwhile, the Sherman's versatility proved its lasting strength. It served as the foundation for post-war designs like the M26, Pershing, and the M46 Patton, tanks that inherited its reliability and upgraded its power. The same production principles, standardized parts, modular design, and mass mobility became hallmarks of NATO's future armored forces. Even outside the United States, the Sherman's legacy lived on. Thousands were supplied to Britain, Canada, France, and the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. After 1945, they appeared again in the wars of independence, in Korea, in the Middle East, still fighting decades after the Panther had vanished into museums. But beyond the technical lineage was a moral one. The Shermans' story became a lesson in how a nation's character can shape its weapons. The United States had not sought perfection. It had sought victory through persistence. It had built a tank not for duels, but for the relentless grind of a long, total war. A war that demanded reliability, repair, and reach more than elegance. For German veterans, the memory was more conflicted. Many spoke with admiration for the Panther's design, but with resignation toward its practicality. We could not win with masterpieces. One former Panzer commander remarked in a 1946 interview, "When they could build 1,000 workhorses." The psychological impact of this truth endured. The myth of Allied inferiority in armor, born from early encounters with Tigers and Panthers, began to dissolve under data and testimony. Historians realized that victory had not come from outgunning the enemy, but from outlasting him. When American analysts at Ardennes, proving ground-tested, captured Panthers in 1946, they confirmed what the crews had learned in blood. The Panther's mechanical fragility outweighed its combat advantages. Its gearbox cracked under stress, its engine overheated, and its final drive failed after just a few dozen hours. The Sherman, by comparison, could drive from Normandy to Berlin with minimal overhaul. In the final balance, numbers told the story. The U.S. Army lost over 4,000 Shermans in Northwest Europe, a staggering figure, yet one it could sustain. Germany lost nearly all of its Panthers and Tigers, along with the irreplaceable crews who manned them. And in that brutal arithmetic, the truth of modern war revealed itself. Durability defeats perfection. By 1945, the German dream of tactical superiority had been buried under the strategic reality of American production. The Panther had fired the first shot in many duels, but the Sherman, repaired, rebuilt, and reborn, fired the last. Across post-war Europe, the rusting hulks of both tanks were left where they fell, monuments to two opposing visions of war. The Panther represented the brilliance of a nation chasing technological mastery. The Sherman, the strength of a nation mastering endurance. Those silent relics, half buried in the soil of France and Belgium, stood as reminders that wars are not won by the strongest weapon, but by the weapon that can keep fighting. And from that truth emerged the armored philosophy of the modern age, the belief that resilience, not perfection, defines victory. The story of the Sherman and the Panther is more than a tale of machines. It is a reflection of two very different ways of understanding war. One, built on genius, the other on endurance. The Germans built tanks to dominate, to crush, to awe. Each Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, elegant, deadly, and fragile. But in their pursuit of perfection, they forgot the simplest rule of warfare: a weapon that cannot be where it is needed. When it is needed is no weapon at all. The Americans built the Sherman to fight every day, in every condition, with every ally. It was not invincible. It was dependable. Its armor could crack. Its gun could fail to penetrate. But its heart, the will of its crews, and the vast engine of industry behind them never faltered. In the ruins of Europe, that difference decided the future. The Panther would become an artifact of brilliance, admired, studied, but gone. The Sherman would become a symbol of continuity. Still running, still adapted, still serving on battlefields from Korea to the Middle East. And in that endurance lay a deeper lesson, that war is not a contest of perfection, but of persistence. It is not won by the weapon that shines brightest in a single duel, but by the one that survives the long road, the bitter cold, the endless push forward. For the German crews of 1944, it was unthinkable that a Sherman could keep fighting after a direct Panther hit. For the American crews inside those tanks, it was never about disbelief. It was about duty. They would patch the armor, reload, climb back in, and drive on. Because in the end, the Sherman was never just a tank. It was a promise that even in the face of superior firepower, resilience would endure. And that is why, long after the thunder of the Panther's gun faded from the fields of Normandy, The steady hum of the Sherman's engine became the true sound of victory.